Hey, as people are trickling in, I'd like to say good day and thank you to all for joining the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus of the Canadian Environmental Network for our second webinar in the series Resource Nation, Public Engagement in the Fast Tracking Age. Before we begin, it's February 12th, 2026, and so on behalf of the Canadian Environmental Network, I would like to extend our deepest and most heartfelt condolences to the students, staff, families, first responders, friends, and the community of Tumbler Ridge, whose lives have been forever changed. We remain committed to coming together as a nation to support your children and nurture your community. And we are so sorry for the tragedy that unfolded just a few days ago. As we come together today, we acknowledge that we are all on sacred land that has been the subject of many treaties, and that this land is and was the traditional territory of many diverse Indigenous people, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island. I am once again online from Treaty 1, the territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Asininu, Dakota, and Dene nations, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. I'm grateful to live, work, and play on Turtle Island. And I'm grateful that on Turtle Island, we have this practice now where we start our meetings by honoring and thinking about the land and the people on whose land we live. It's our sincere hope that this acknowledgement starts our webinar in a good way. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Canadian Environmental Network is a nonpartisan organization that serves to connect, support, and mobilize an informed and committed network of organizations and individuals working to secure a healthy environment and a stable climate for Canada. And the EPA, or Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus, is a subgroup of the network. And our group focuses on fostering effective impact assessment and planning in Canada. Today, our webinar is about regional assessments with the subtitle, The Path to More Efficient, Effective, and Trustworthy Decisions, said in a questioning way. For those who are not familiar with regional assessments, in short, a regional assessment focuses on a specific area, like a watershed or an ecozone or an economic zone that's been identified by a government. And a regional assessment, unlike the typical project-specific assessment, considers what has happened in that area, what could happen in the future, and what options would be the most desirable with the least negative impacts on the people and the environment or ecosystem. Regional assessments can focus on a specific sector, such as hydroelectric development or mining, but they may focus on something else, like a valued component, such as a caribou, or a plan, like a plan to develop a marine protected area. So there's a lot of flexibility in the purpose and objectives of a regional assessment, which is both a strength and something that needs to be carefully thought out. The purpose of a regional assessment is also more flexible. It can be used to guide project assessments or inform the development of policies and programs or plans and regulations. It can be used to collect in a more systematic way information about the flora and fauna and people within a region, particularly one that may be about to experience significant industrial development. And in turn, that kind of regional assessment should explore ways to manage that development, again, with the intent of minimizing the negative consequences. Canada has growing experience with regional assessments. And today we're honored to be hearing from 3 panelists, all of whom are members of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus. Mike Kofahl, Dr. Robert Gibson, or Bob, and Anna Johnston. So before we begin, here's the agenda. We're going to give our speakers an opportunity to share their thoughts today, first as individual presentations and then as a panel. We will then have an opportunity for the panelists to respond to questions from the audience. So as a audience can type in your questions at any time into the question and answer period, and I will curate the interaction with the panel based on what you type in. So type away. And as a reminder, when you entered the webinar, you heard that we are recording the event. So you may want to keep your videos off and your microphones are muted. For this webinar, I've decided to introduce each panelist before they present. So first on our agenda today, we're going to hear from Mike Kofahl. He's a staff lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law. Mike's practice focuses largely on marine and coastal law issues, including coastal protection and access, marine protected areas, shipping, offshore regulation, and wetland stewardship. He has been actively engaged in the regional assessment of offshore energy in Atlantic Canada and brings that expertise with us today. So, welcome.
Thank you, Trish. And it's good to be here. So I'm just going to dive right in. I only have 8 minutes. So I'm going to be talking about the offshore regional assessments of wind development in both Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. And I'm not in control of the slides here. Okay, perfect. So just a quick overview. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the structure and the processes and some of the technical pieces. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the public participation elements, and that's kind of embedded throughout the slides and the discussion. And then just focus quickly on some of the high level lessons learned on how regional assessments can be useful and where there's room for improvement. So I just want to quickly contextualize the regional assessments. Patricia gave a really great overview. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada does have a policy framework for regional assessments, and you can see the central objective here is really about effectiveness and efficiency of future processes and decision making, and then also understanding cumulative effects. So regional assessment is not proponent led, it's really led by the agency or by a committee. And it's really meant to be a high-level regional review. And there's some really important legal requirements, many of which are focused on engaging the public, participants, stakeholders, rights holders in that process, and then having a final outcome, which is a report to the minister. And that's really important because the two regional assessments are focused on quite large areas. With a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and you can go to the next slide. There's two images here. So these are the offshore study areas for the two regional assessments. They're quite large areas, vast areas. And so the regional assessments were looking at these two areas over the course of 18 months under the original time frame. Eventually that got pushed to 22 months, but a lot of things going on in those two offshore areas. And so the regional assessment committees were tasked with an enormous undertaking, which is to study these and understand potential impacts of offshore wind development. You can go to the next slide. So the key of the kind of mandate for the two committees was looking at planning, licensing, and future impact assessment of specific projects. And so the structure of this regional assessment process was a committee that was appointed for each of the regional assessments with 5 members. There was a secretariat, which was led by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada with support from provincial and federal departments. Undertaking all that work, so the secretariat was providing input, was helping them plan engagement sessions, and then the committee was doing that work of working through all that information, the maps, the input from the public, from various industry. And then there were these 3 advisory groups that were meant to also help the committee and allow the committee to go to them if they needed specific questions answered or specific information explored further. Those 3 advisory groups were free for people to engage with. So if you were a community member or an industry leader or an organizational representative or someone from government, you could engage in these advisory groups. The 3 advisory groups were Indigenous knowledge, scientific information and community knowledge, and fisheries and other oceans. And these were really set up to dig into specifics that the committee was exploring. And then it was the way the structure was put out, the there was opportunity for the committees to establish additional advisory groups, so on an ad hoc basis. And so the Newfoundland Committee actually established a fourth gender-based analysis plus advisory group to help them dig into that topic a little bit more. And that's basically how the full process went. There was a committee doing the main work, the analysis, the secretariat supporting that. There was a lot of engagement, and then these advisory groups. In terms of the kind of key process steps, regional assessments start with a draft terms of reference. You can go to the next slide there. Yeah, perfect. So this is the first look at what the agency, what the key people putting this together are looking at. And the terms of reference basically set up the conduct of the entire regional assessment. So draft terms of reference were established. There was a public consultation period. The final terms of reference were put out, and the committee was appointed. The committees did their work over the first 12 months, and they produced an interim report. And they were really looking to inform the first part of their work, and then it ended. The regional assessment ended with a final report, which goes to the minister. So you go to the next slide. So the enormous areas in the offshore. This is a map of, you can see the focus area, kind of the striped lines. That was the full focus area that the committee actually scoped out of their larger study area. So the first 1 year of the committee's work was actually, where do we actually focus our efforts in this massive process? Once they completed that, they had engagement. They started gathering more information about more specific areas. And then they continued their work to continuously refine that using constraints analysis. They kind of cut out areas that were over 200 meters in depth, for example. They cut out a buffer zone along the coast. They were trying to identify conflicts. They cut out areas where there was potential for icebergs to impact offshore. And they kind of continued to hone down and eventually identified potential areas for offshore wind licensing. The Nova Scotia committee took a very similar approach to constraints analysis. So they spent their first year identifying potential areas that they could look at, and then they continued to refine that. After a year, they provided an interim report. They identified these potential development areas, and then they continued to refine those and the parameters around those based on more information they were gathering at the same time, based on information and engagement they were getting from communities. They came out with 8 areas. There were 5 tier 1 sites and 3 tier 2 sites. The tier 1 sites were identified as areas where there was real potential, and this was where we really have to be looking for in the near future. And the tier 2 sites where these are probably sites we can look at, but we probably need a little bit more information. And in Nova Scotia, following the conclusion of that regional assessment, there has actually been follow-up based on those recommendations. The federal government and the government of Nova Scotia have actually identified offshore wind energy areas based on these areas. So there are 3 offshore wind energy areas where they're actually actively working to start a call for bids for offshore wind. So it's a kind of a funneling effect where you have the initial high region and you're continuously using your information to modify parameters. I can go to the next slide. So there was a ton of opportunity for public participation, and this is one of the real benefits of regional assessment, is the ability to start early engagement, early learning. In Nova Scotia, some of the community sessions, the first community sessions I went to, people were coming and they were like, what is offshore wind? What does that even look like? We don't even have that in Canada. What's the difference between a floating platform and an anchored platform? What does that look like? What does it mean to transmit energy from the offshore to the coast? What are substations? How big are these things? And what kinds of things do we need to put in place now so we can be prepared in the future to build these massive projects? Another really key document was the participation plans. So these were actually essentially plans that the committee put together with the advisor groups to set out some of the work, and they were continuously evolving as the regional assessments went along. And there was tons of engagement and learning in the communities, and so the committees actually would go into communities ask them questions, provide information, and then could go back and ask more questions, refine their approach as they went along. And there were also many opportunities to provide written submissions throughout the process, to respond to interim reports, to provide resources, gray literature, advice, both through the advisory committee and through written submissions. And so there was overall a lot of optimism around the regional assessments. They were generally understood to be really positive places where you could provide input. A lot of effort on early planning and thinking about informing future planning, future licensing for offshore wind, future assessments, and even the governance, because in this space, there was no regulatory regime for offshore wind. So it was about helping to refine some of the other processes that were going on in parallel. And it was another real strength was just identifying gaps and opportunities. What don't we know about the offshore? What don't we know about offshore wind in Canada? Well, we don't know anything because we've never done it before. So what do we have to do to start doing the assessment of individual projects? And then I mentioned off the top that one of the pieces of regional assessment is cumulative effects assessment, identifying if we have a whole bunch of projects, what do they all do when they're interacting with each other, interacting with other things in the offshore. Both the committees didn't really undertake a full cumulative effects assessment. They didn't have enough time for one, and they didn't have capacity, and they didn't really know what to do, and so they kind of put it off for the future. And so the second kind of grouped into that is that there was a missed opportunity to have a follow-up program to do some of that work. So there's lots of great recommendations, and some of those are being followed through right now. Others are being considered. But there's no real singular process for us to actually follow those recommendations through, and to make sure that they're picked up on in the future as we move along with offshore wind development. I think that's pretty much my time. This is my contact information, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mike. That was a great first presentation about two very detailed regional assessments. Next on our panel is Dr. Robert Gibson, or Bob, who is a professor in the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. And Bob, you have people in the audience who are your alumni, in addition to me. Since the 1970s, he's worked with communities, governments, public interest organizations, and informal collaborations on impact assessment. His recent scholarly and applied efforts have centered on how to best give serious attention to sustainability imperatives in a range of applications, including in regional assessment. And as Anna noted and is on the slide, Bob's been actively involved in the regional assessment of the Ring of Fire.
Hi all, I'm Bob Gibson, and I am at the University of Waterloo. And as Trish mentioned, I have been involved in the Ring of Fire regional assessment. I'm an as-needed advisor to the Regional Assessment Working Group, which is representatives of the 15 First Nations and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, who are the partners leading the regional assessment. This assessment is about major mining developments, potentially major mining developments in the Ring of Fire area in Northern Ontario, which is mineral rich and is also in Indigenous territories. The regional assessment began in 2025, at the beginning of 2025, and will end halfway through next year. The next slide. Oh, good. We already have it. You will see on the slide in the top map a purple splotch. That's the core mineralization of the Ring of Fire that has attracted all the economic and other attention. It's not much like a ring in the picture, and the color is wrong for fire, but you'll have to use your imagination. You'll also notice, perhaps, if you look carefully, a light green line that encompasses a much larger area. That's the area of the possible, most likely cumulative effects being roughly identified, probably incompletely identified, but well enough to cover the traditional territories of the 15 First Nations who are partners in the exercise. The area of mining is not the only part that involves development. There will also be roads, power lines, other services, and other induced developments if significant investment is made in the Ring of Fire itself. There will be resulting positive and adverse cumulative effects, and you can see some of those in the list on the slide. Next slide, please. It's the mineral riches that have attracted the economic and political enthusiasm, but the realities of doing mining and servicing it in that area are fairly significant. The lands covered in the broader region covered by the regional assessment include the lands and watersheds of many First Nations communities. So there's communities who are downstream from any mining effects. Secondly, the Indigenous people involved have, not surprisingly, significant needs for better livelihood opportunities, but also need and want to maintain the lands and waters because those are fundamental to their rights, traditions, languages, food, etc. Also, the land is very wet, boggy, ecologically important, and is characterized by peatlands, which are crucial for carbon sequestration. All these lands and characteristics are vulnerable to permanent damage. And the wet and boggy characteristics make provision of mine roads and doing mining particularly difficult. The biggest challenge is probably that the area is hundreds of kilometers from existing roads and rail lines. So there's a map on the right there, the bigger map, which has roads that would provide access to the Ring of Fire area, which is light green at the top, and also two of the communities, Webequie and Martin Falls, which are along the right. So these are community access roads as well as mining access roads, and they're divided into three components for assessment purposes, but constitute a significant provision of infrastructure and investment, since they're expected to cost something north of $2 billion. So at this stage, what could happen beyond these roads has not yet been carefully considered, and there are quite different development trajectories that could be examined, could be compared, and could be open to influence by relevant decision makers. So the assessment is really about regional scale evaluations of the main possibilities to identify what options are desirable and which ones should be avoided. Next slide, please. We do a regional assessment in cases like this, and we should do more often for two reasons. One is that many places, including this one, don't have an established process for regional planning that would work out at least some of these issues. Secondly, while many places have project-level assessments have significant deficiencies in trying to deal with the effects of multiple activities, in this case, multiple mines and other infrastructure, so forth. And they're very weak traditionally on looking at broad alternatives, since the focus is on individual projects one by one. And broad alternatives are the key question for the participants in a regional assessment who are facing different development trajectories and the possibility of choosing sensibly among those options. Next slide, please. The regional assessment is underway. It is going through a reasonably logical process that is set out in the 6 points on the slide. The 6 items follow some kind of logical sequence, but they are also mutually influential and they overlap. And so it's probably more sensible to think about them as a set of things that are being examined iteratively, and they're all one turtle, as is indicated by the image. There are lasting objectives and priorities. There are identification and evaluation of different futures set out in a range of scenarios to determine what futures to favor, what needs to be done immediately to prepare for and guide preparations, and to protect areas that might be vulnerable to adverse cumulative effects. Finally, there's interest in what kinds of governance arrangements will continue after the regional assessment to deal with the ongoing issues. Next slide, please. Here we have, almost illegibly in the smaller print, the key priorities that have been identified thus far in the regional assessment. All of them are elaborated further in community-centered studies. And the small print is worth taking a look at. You can find it on the regional assessments site on the Impact Assessment Agency's registry. It's all of them are in the interim report that was released last month. Next slide, please. And here is a brief outline of what the scenarios are trying to cover. There are 2 key dimensions. One is that there is, on the right-hand side, different intensities of potential development. The null option is no major mines, and the other 3 are at increasing intensities from low to high over a period of time. And on the right-hand side, you can see highlighted in green the periods of time that are roughly being examined. So 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 60 years from now, and 150 years from now, which represents 7 generations. And all of that work is being designed and will be evaluated in light of the priorities that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please.
Probably 30 seconds left, Bob.
No problem. We're whooshing towards the end. So this is the last key slide about anticipated results. The key things to be informed are about what are the options that are favored or to be avoided, what are the means of preparing for those options in guidance for individual projects, for programs, policies, various agreements, permitting, and so forth. And there'll be recommendations only that come out of this process. Regional assessments don't have authority to make decisions. They are providing guidance and recommendations. It's also worth noting that I haven't mentioned the province of Ontario, which so far has not been involved in the process. So there are some limitations and some challenges to be faced. Nonetheless, if I can have the last slide, I have a cheery conclusion. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I wondered if you'd get to the last slide. Our third speaker is Anna Johnston. Anna is a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. Her work focuses on environmental impact assessment, climate, and biodiversity law. She's co-chair of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus and a member of the Ministers' Advisory Committee on Impact Assessment.
Thank you, Trish. Great to be here. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about how and why the public may want to participate in regional assessments, which both Bob and Mike have already touched on a little bit, but I'll be talking about it in a more general way. My presentation is based on this chapter, or a chapter in this guide to public participation under the Impact Assessment Act that our caucus published a year or so ago. It was actually Mike who wrote the regional assessment chapter, but we didn't want him to have to do two back-to-back presentations, so I'm stepping in today. You can access the guide through that QR code, and we can put a link to it in the chat. The regional assessment chapter is number 16. Next slide. So why get involved in a regional assessment? Bob did a really good job of answering that question. I'll just reiterate that they can be one of the best opportunities that we have for members of the public and Indigenous peoples and governments to come together to assess the environmental, social, and economic state of a region, come up with a vision for how you want that region to look in the future, and then develop a roadmap for achieving that vision. As Bob noted, regional assessments can be much more effective at assessing and helping manage cumulative effects than project level assessments are. And by giving proponents a roadmap for when and under what conditions development might be allowed, regional assessments can help avoid situations where the public and Indigenous peoples are having to play whack-a-mole against unsustainable and undesirable projects. So if you care about the ecological integrity of a region, or you like to hunt or fish in it, or it's your place to go and play and commune with nature, and you're worried that those things that you really care about could be threatened by future projects and activities, then a regional assessment could be your ticket to having a say in how to preserve those values. Next slide. So we had a question earlier, when and how and why are regional assessments launched? It's the environment minister who orders a regional assessment to take place. The minister can either establish a committee to do the assessment or ask the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada to conduct it. The minister's decision to launch a regional assessment is based on advice from the Impact Assessment Agency, and the agency has developed guidance that includes the considerations that it will consider when it's making that advice to the minister. So it's a helpful resource. According to the guidance, the main considerations are whether the regional assessment could improve the effectiveness and efficiency of project assessments, whether there are effects like cumulative effects that regional assessments are better positioned to address than project level assessment or regulatory decision-making, whether the assessment could help inform decisions about projects in emerging sectors for which we don't have a lot of knowledge or experience, whether there are any other existing or planned initiatives that could achieve the same results, the potential for effects on Indigenous peoples and their rights, the degree of public and Indigenous interest in having a regional assessment and in issues in the area. Importantly, the agency will also consider whether the regional assessment could be used to exempt projects from impact assessment, which was the case in two earlier assessments of offshore oil in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. So if you are considering requesting a regional assessment, just be aware that it could undermine your ability to get project level assessments done in that region in the future. Next slide. So if you do still want to go ahead and request a regional assessment, I recommend you check out the Impact Assessment Agency's operational guide. The QR code there links to that guide. The guide sets out the considerations that I just walked through and goes into more detail about how to best tailor your request. It's important to note that if you are requesting a regional assessment, there are constitutional restraints on the federal government's ability to plan and regulate projects and project effects. So it will be really helpful to focus your request for a regional assessment on the potential for effects on areas of federal jurisdiction. And those effects include impacts on fisheries, migratory birds, navigable waters, transboundary effects like transboundary river pollution, and impacts on Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being. And you should also be clear in a request that the regional assessment is an important tool for being able to address those kinds of effects better than, say, a project level assessment or regulatory processes. Next slide. So the Impact Assessment Act is not prescriptive about regional assessments compared to the process for project level assessments. It's pretty open. Mike walked through a few main process steps in his presentation, and then the agency's guidance sets out 8 steps in total. The first is the minister's decision to conduct the assessment. The second is then entering into any agreements with other jurisdictions to coordinate or jointly conduct the assessment, like with the provincial or Indigenous government. The third is then planning how the regional assessment should be conducted and what are the things that it should look at. For example, focusing on just a certain type of projects, what effects to look at, what are the main considerations and objectives of the assessment. The minister will establish draft terms of reference and at that point in time decide whether or not to establish a committee or ask the agency to conduct the assessment. The minister will make those terms of reference available for a public comment period before finalizing them. Once the terms of reference are in place, then the assessment itself can begin. And it involves things like identifying what studies to do and who should do them, engaging the public and Indigenous peoples, identifying, as Bob was talking about, the different development scenarios, basically gathering and assessing all of the relevant information needed. And then whoever is conducting the assessment, the agency or the committee, prepares a draft report, makes that report available for public comment, and then finally submits it to the minister. And as Bob noted, assessment reports don't result in binding decisions. They really are just advice and recommendations and information to guide future decisions that the minister or other federal officials may make. Ideally, the regional assessment, as Mike was talking about, doesn't end when the minister gets the report, but is kept going through follow-up programs that involve things like ongoing monitoring and updating of information and management of effects. But we're still pretty early on in our experience with regional assessments at the federal level and don't yet have a firm grasp on whether or how that follow-up might occur. Next slide. So this is my last slide. Just if you want to participate in a regional assessment, how can you make the most of it? For starters, I recommend getting involved as early as possible so that you can influence key scoping decisions like what the assessment looks at and how it's conducted. You should also make sure to ask, as Mike noted, there is a requirement for participant funding. Try to make sure that those numbers tend to be set in advance, but you may wish to advocate for enough funding to compensate fully for your time and for your efforts, and also to help you hire subject matter experts if you want help in things like preparing submissions and reviewing materials. Those subject matter experts can be really helpful in making sure that assessments are considering all of the relevant factors and that information is accurate. The Act does require that there be opportunities for meaningful public participation in regional assessments. It doesn't prescribe when and how those are carried out. So I recommend that you also ask for more than just written comment periods. You might want to ask for things like community dialogue sessions and public hearings so that you're able to have two-way conversations and not just your thoughts in writing into the black void. I also suggest that you look at how you might be able to coordinate with other participants so that you can share information, collaborate on areas that you agree on, and if possible, divvy up key issues between you so you're not duplicating each other's work or spreading yourselves too thin. Coordinating can be especially helpful if you want to hire subject matter experts so you're not spending a lot of money on what ends up being effectively the same reports. And while regional assessments tend to be a little lower key than project assessments, you may wish to try to build public support around your asks through things like letter writing campaigns, local media, especially if you think the assessment isn't going in the direction you want it to. The Impact Assessment Agency is your friend. They have a dedicated team of engagement specialists and a mandate to be helpful, so don't hesitate to reach out to them, especially the staff that are helping run or support the regional assessment, to ask any questions, get help navigating the process, or make whatever points that you want to make. And then finally, our caucus is also here to help. We have over 100 members. with deep expertise and experience in impact assessment, and we would be pleased to provide with any assistance in regional assessments beyond things like this webinar. So you can find our contact information on our website and in your registration materials, and we hope to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Anna. There are a number of questions that are already in the chat, but please continue to type some in if you've thought of something that you'd like to ask. All three of our panelists talked about how there's no way to enforce implementation of recommendations, but Stephanie was asking, are there options? Are there ways that you could see that the recommendations inform subsequent impact assessments? I'm going to start with Mike, because you might have some ideas about, changes to the accord that might have happened or been related to the regional assessment.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that there are requirements to consider a regional assessment in future impact assessments of the projects that were considered in the regional assessment. So if there's a regional assessment of offshore wind, any future project level impact assessment has to consider that regional assessment. We don't know what that means per se, whether it's the information, whether it's the recommendations, like that's a little bit up in the air, I suppose. But a lot of information analysis is generated in a regional assessment, and there is a final report. So that would all have to be considered during that impact assessment. We also have seen so the first regional assessment that was completed under the impact assessment of offshore petroleum exploratory drilling did actually have a follow-up program. That follow-up program is actually ongoing. So asking for a follow-up program, you don't have to initiate the follow-up program right away. Maybe it can be a request that eventually leads to a follow-up program. You can use that information in future planning. You can use that information in submissions. If you're a member of the public, you can identify those recommendations. In the offshore regional, at the same time as the offshore regional assessments were going on for offshore wind, there was a parallel process, Bill C-49 amendments to Accord Acts, which are pieces of legislation, joint legislation with provincial and federal government. So the two provinces have their own legislation setting out the regulation of initially offshore petroleum, but that they were opened up to add offshore renewable energy. And so those are two processes that were happening at the same time. So they were helping feed each other. So information that was being learned at the regional assessment was then being used in public submissions and in the development of the regulations for the regulation of offshore renewable energy. And so there's ways to use information in one process to substantiate comments, submissions in another. Those are just two examples.
Thank you, Mike. Bob or Anna, do you have anything to add?
Mike nailed it.
Oh, excellent. All right, we have a question from anonymous attendee. If you have a project with regional implications, but there are no plans in place for a regional assessment, what can you incorporate in your project specific assessment to help address regional concerns?
I might jump in just since I'm already off mute. I think it's a great question. My first thought goes to the scope of the cumulative effects assessment. Agency guidance has long said that cumulative effects assessment ought to look at the cumulative effects of past, present, and foreseeable projects. So that's a way that you can make sure that the assessment is looking at the effects of other projects and activities around you. The other, I think, critical thing, and this is particularly important when you're dealing with development-inducing projects like the roads into the Ring of Fire or transmission lines, that you're trying to get the scope of assessment to include all of the induced activities and the effects of those, the potential activities that could be brought on by the project. Unfortunately, oftentimes those things are scoped out. In particular, I think there's a concern that effects that are outside of the control of the proponent ought not to be assessed because the assessment can't result in like binding conditions regarding those other effects. So it really is just all the more reason to be advocating for regional assessments, even if the project assessment is already underway, and just noting that like the assessments of the roads in the Ring of Fire area had already started before the regional assessment was triggered. So not the preferred sequencing, but it is possible to get a regional assessment just because of the inherent limitations and the reluctance of assessment authorities to broadly scope project level assessments.
Thank you, Anna. Bob, do you have anything to add?
Oh, excuse me, very briefly. Project assessments are not well designed or situated to do good work on cumulative effects or broad alternatives, as I mentioned. But that's not to say there haven't been assessments at the project level that have done great work, actually. There have been cases that the projects were broad enough, the scoping was broad enough, the broader questions raised by various parties were ones that were centered on regional consequences, that those were addressed very well. So it's not impossible, and many of the relevant jurisdictions have project level legislation that at least was recently broad enough to take into account those matters, at least on a project by project basis. That doesn't happen very often, but then regional assessments are extremely rare still. So project assessments are often the only venue that could possibly be available to deal with those regional things in the circumstances of particular cases.
Mike?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna, I actually initially read this question as a proponent asking what could a proponent incorporate into their impact assessment. But I think my answer would be relevant to anyone really engaging in a potential project, which is early planning. I mean, the regional assessments, the main reason to do them is the early planning. Start conversations early because the regional assessments don't have enough time. The timeline for project assessments is not enough. There's always going to be more work to be done to understand impact. So if you start those conversations early, whether it's with your neighbor or your local municipal councillor or your friends or in a community group, you can start building that base of knowledge because everyone has something to contribute. And if you're not having those conversations early, you might miss out.
Thank you. Both of the last two answers lead us to a group of questions, which I'm going to start with or preface with. In the era of nation building projects and the Major Projects Office, what governance levels or policy tools exist or should be created to require or incentivize joint or linked assessments, regional assessments, so that cumulative effects and regional impacts are dealt with? Big question, lots of big thinkers. Bob's unmuted, so would you like to talk about what levers should exist or do exist first?
What I didn't get the last of your sentence, sorry.
What levers should exist or do exist to incentivize regional assessments in the era of nation building projects and the Major Projects Office?
I'm tempted to say divine intervention would be most useful. But I suspect that we've had enough experience with project assessments and other case-specific initiatives that there's a lot of people who recognize their insufficiency. And there are also a host of different tools that can potentially be available. Regional assessments are one. We've had commissions of inquiry of various kinds for generations that have looked in detail at broader matters. Some of those are royal commissions, some of them are one-off initiatives established by some jurisdiction. They've been done at all levels of government. There's lots of tools potentially available. And it's also possible, in the absence of all of that, all of the government provided processes for broader regional conversations to arise and be influential. I think we can all think of examples of that where smaller initiatives in a variety of places have led to broader regional and larger scale changes. That's certainly true in Southern Ontario with various initiatives that eventually led to the Green Belt and growth management planning in a variety of places. I know that's true in Southern British Columbia. So those kinds of initiatives sometimes will grow from specific concerns, or at least regional concerns that spread into broader ones. I think there's lots of tools and creativity is necessary. And divine intervention may come if it does, but probably not to be counted upon.
Anna, do you have thoughts?
I mean, just that in this, not just federal, but in many provinces, push to fast track project assessment and decision making. The first thing on my wish list would be that as a prerequisite to any kind of streamlining or fast tracking, that there has to be a regional or strategic assessment in place to help inform. Like as Mike was talking about, regional assessments are one of the best tools that we have for improving the efficiency of project level assessment. They shouldn't be a replacement for project level assessment, but they can make those project assessments, much more efficient for many reasons. And so, for government to do that work up front to make sure that we're looking at the bigger picture, that we have an understanding of the baseline conditions and the likely potential effects of projects, no-go zones, all those things that can bog down project level assessments. They actually did that good work up front, then you can achieve that efficiency without losing efficacy. So, if I were to advocate for one thing, it would be regional assessment as a prerequisite to projects being able to get into a fast track.
Thanks. Mike, do you have anything to add or
I don't know what to add at that point. Oh, it's all good.
wish list?
Yeah.
This one is short, but how do regional assessments differ from strategic assessments, which, as noted by Barry, are practiced in nearly 140 countries around the world?
I'd be happy to take that one on. I think it's valid that regional assessments, as established under the Federal Impact Assessment Act, are a form of strategic assessment. There's separate provision in the law for those strategic assessments, but effectively, there's an overlap in the concept, at least. And while regional assessments under the Federal Act are not decision-making, they can and have led to what amounts to a new governance regime or an expanded governance regime that does adopt conclusions and does some implementation over time. So it has considerable overlapping potential. It's different from what's done in other jurisdictions, but it can lead to that. Also, it's important that many regional assessments are necessarily done in cooperation with provinces and or Indigenous authorities. And those authorities, in addition to the federal government, have jurisdiction and decision-making power on some matters that they can then take forth and be governance bodies. When I talked about continuing governance arrangements, those would be continuing co-governance arrangements in situations like the Ring of Fire. And we have those sometimes.
Thank you, Bob. Nobody's unmuting. So I think this might be our final question, but it'll be for all three panelists. And I'm going to start with Mike. In the cases that we've talked about, so in your cases, what was done to support the public education and people participating in the regional assessment while also they were doing work in multiple overlapping processes? So what support did you see for the public?
I think there was a lot of support. There was a lot of like a genuine attempt by both the committees to try to make the process as engaging and meaningful as they could, given the parameters, which include time limitations and capacity and all the other things. In a perfect world, we'd have unlimited time and money, but we don't. The participant funding is really useful. One of the things I think that sometimes can be a barrier is that you have a participant funding program which has a deadline, and often it's at the beginning of the process. And so you have the participant funding runs, deadline passes, you start engaging with community members start learning, and they're like, oh, what is this? I'd like to participate, but the funding has passed. So the participant funding can be really useful, but also that can be a barrier if it doesn't continue. The committee did a really great job of going into communities, and communities that weren't necessarily close to where there might be transmission lines going into the coast, for example. So in Nova Scotia, in the Nova Scotia example, they went into communities all around the province, including on the side of Cape Breton Island that I actually live on, that was nowhere near their final development areas. They went to Prince Edward Island, they went to New Brunswick, provinces that aren't even connected to those offshore areas, to get a better sense of the regional perspectives. And they went back to those communities. So it wasn't a one and done presentation. It was the first engagement sessions where this is what the regional assessment is. This is not a project. This is not a proponent. This is a regional study. This is what we're looking for. This is initial information about offshore wind. Then they took that information, they did their initial assessment. Then they went back to those communities, provide more information, provide updates. So that iterative approach of, here's what we're learning. What do you think about this now? Was really, really helpful, and people really liked that. So, and I think they found it really useful to help them engage as they went along. And then I would just make a plug that you can always make submissions. Like there are these like formal like 30-day deadlines for the interim report and the draft final report. But you can provide information anytime, and I think that's really helpful to know, is that they consider all the information. You don't need to wait till the formal deadline. If you have a thought or information, send it. The earlier, the better.
Thank you, Mike. Bob, just to slightly tweak the question for you, what supports are you seeing for both nations and the province of Ontario to participate in the regional assessment for the Ring of Fire?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an adequate answer. The province has been kept in the loop on the regional assessment, and what conversations go on within that loop, I don't know. The outreach and engagement efforts of the Ring of Fire regional assessment have been mostly devoted to links with the Indigenous communities. And certainly that's been done with as much devotion as one can imagine seeing, though it's always challenging and the communities face enormous other issues. And so I'm not saying it's all adequate, or maybe that it could be. There is broader public engagement at some stages, or there has been, with interim report being released. The initial discussion of terms of reference was subject to broader consultation as well. And there have been useful contributions, certainly from outside organizations throughout the process. But that's, I think, all I can say about it.
Thank you. Anna, do you have some final words about bringing the public and supporting the public in regional assessments?
Yeah, and I know we're at the last minute, so I'll just say, the agency has good guidance, helpful guidance on the steps of the process and factors to consider. Often the public wants more help sort of navigating how they can be most effective and strategic in their participation. And that's when groups like ours, like our Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus, we have a long history of going and working with community groups and organizations that are participating in processes like these. Also, our various individual groups like Mike's East Coast Environmental Law, my West Coast Environmental Law, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, great resources for getting that more strategic advice on how you can really maximize your participation. So the agency does a really good job, but it's not only the agency's job or only the agency's role. Other groups also are playing an active role in helping people both navigate and maximally participate in assessments.
Thank you for the webinar. And a warm thank you to Mike and Bob and Anna for sharing their thoughts, expertise, and experience with us today. We're also grateful to Cass for making this webinar series possible. She's behind the scenes making this all work. Funding was provided to the caucus by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And if you're interested in watching this again, we hope to make a recording of today's presentation available on our site in the coming days. Our next webinar will focus on substitution, using Canada's experience with British Columbia as a foundation. It's scheduled for March 12th, so 1 month from today. For more information about the webinar series or to sign up, please go to the caucus website. If you're interested in joining or collaborating with the Canadian Environmental Network as an environmental organization working across Turtle Island, or as an individual with shared vision and mission, we welcome your application. Membership is inexpensive, and the benefits, here I'm thinking about the access to resources, and Anna talked about how many people are part of the Environmental Assessment Caucus, are well worth the very small expense. We have great connections with like-minded groups and individuals, and a really informative listserv. So if you want to become a member, more information is on the Canadian Environmental Network website under the tab Mentorship. Finally, as we say goodbye for today, please consider filling out the very short survey that will pop up at the end. It'll ask you some brief questions about today's webinar and what you'd like to hear about in the future. So wishing everyone wellness. I look forward to seeing you on the 12th. Take care.
And thanks, Trish.